mud drying on the hem of a cheap wool skirt. That was all Beatrice Hallam brought to Oakhaven, aside from a forged letter of recommendation and a desperate need to disappear. She didn't plan to tame the feral children haunting the estate's rotting corridors. She certainly didn't plan to cross paths with Arthur Pendleton, a man whose reputation left widows destitute and rivals bleeding in the Thames. But survival makes liars of us all. Welcome to a romance stripped of velvet and lace. Rain battered the carriage roof, sounding less like water and more like a handful of gravel thrown by a spiteful child. Beatrice leaned her head against the rattling window pane. The glass was freezing. It leached the heat straight out of her cheek, but she didn't pull away. The cold kept her awake. It kept her sharp. She rubbed her thumb over her index finger, feeling the permanent, rough callus left by years of gripping cheap pens. Beneath her cloak, her stomach gave a hollow, scraping ache. Breakfast had been half a biscuit at a coaching inn at dawn, and it was now well past 4 in the afternoon. When the carriage finally lurched to a halt, there was no welcoming committee. Beatrice paid the driver from a thin velvet purse, her fingers stiff and clumsy in the biting wind. The man didn't meet her eyes. He just grabbed the coins, tipped his sodden hat, and drove off, leaving her standing in the mud before Oakhaven. The house did not look grand. It looked exhausted. Built of dark weeping stone, its facade was choked by aggressive ivy that seemed to be pulling the structure slowly back into the earth. The massive oak front doors were scuffed, the brass knocker tarnished black. Beatrice dragged her trunk up the steps herself. Her shoulders screamed in protest. She wasn't a fragile woman, but the trunk held everything she owned. 3 plain dresses, a patched nightgown, and a stolen copy of Milton. She let the heavy iron knocker fall. It took 3 minutes for the door to open. A woman stood there, smelling sharply of lye soap and boiled cabbage. Her face was a map of deep, disapproving lines. "You're late," the woman said. No greeting, no name. "The mud on the roads," Beatrice replied, keeping her tone perfectly flat. She stepped inside before she was invited, forcing the housekeeper to step back. "Beatrice Hallam, I have my papers." "Mrs. Gable." The housekeeper didn't look at the papers Beatrice held out. Her eyes darted instead to the muddy hem of Beatrice's skirt, dripping onto the checkerboard marble floor. "The Duke is not in residence. He is in London. He is always in London. You will manage the girls entirely. Keep them out of the East Wing, keep them quiet, and do not bother the staff for extra coals. You get 1 bucket a day." Beatrice nodded once. She didn't feel relief that the Duke was away, only a dull, practical satisfaction. Arthur Pendleton, the Duke of Rothay, was a man whispered about in the grimy taverns and glittering ballrooms alike. He didn't fight duels. He ruined ledgers. He bought debts, starved out competitors, and allegedly watched a man drown in the docks without taking his cigar from his mouth. Beatrice had zero interest in the aristocracy, especially the lethal ones. She just needed his money and his roof. Mrs. Gable led her up 3 flights of stairs. The air grew colder the higher they climbed. The smell of damp plaster was overwhelming, mixed with the faint, sour odour of old carpets. "Your room," Mrs. Gable said, pushing open a door. It was a narrow box. A narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a window that didn't quite shut, letting in a persistent whistling draught. "Breakfast is at 6. The girls are your problem now." Mrs. Gable turned and left, her heavy shoes thudding against the floorboards. Beatrice set her trunk at the foot of the bed. She didn't unpack. She walked to the window, wedged a folded piece of paper into the gap to stop the whistling, and sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned. She unlaced her boots, her hands shaking slightly from the cold and the adrenaline crash. She wasn't a governess. She was a bookkeeper's daughter who had doctored a dead woman's references to escape a landlord who wanted rent paid in favours rather than shillings. Beatrice pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in her rough wool skirt, and breathed in the smell of rain and wet sheep. She was here. She was safe. For now. At 7 the next morning, Beatrice met her wards. She had found her way to the nursery by following the sound of something smashing. She pushed open the heavy oak door, her heart doing a slow, heavy thud in her chest. The nursery was a disaster. Books were strewn across the rug with their spines broken. A china doll lay decapitated in the hearth. Standing on a heavy mahogany table in the center of the room were two girls, perhaps 8 years old. Twins. They had dark, matted hair, smudges of soot on their faces, and they were holding brass candlesticks like clubs. They froze when Beatrice walked in. Beatrice didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She stood in the doorway, letting the draft from the hall rush past her ankles, and simply looked at them. They smelled like unwashed hair and stale sugar. "I'm Miss Hallam," Beatrice said. Her voice wasn't warm. It was the same tone she used to haggle with fishmongers. The girl on the left, missing a front tooth, scowled. "The last one cried when we threw a frog in her tea. I don't drink tea," Beatrice lied. She loved tea, she just couldn't afford it. She walked into the room, stepping deliberately over the decapitated doll, and pulled a chair away from the table. She sat down. "Put the candlesticks down. They're heavy, and if you drop one on your toe, I won't carry you to the doctor." The girls exchanged a look. This wasn't the script. "We are the ladies of this house," the other twin declared, jutting out a small, aggressive chin. "You are 8, Beatrice corrected, and you look like chimney sweeps. Which one is Clara and which is Josephine?" "I'm Clara," the toothless one said, lowering her candlestick an inch. Beatrice leaned back in her chair. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing sound in the quiet room. She ignored it. "Right, here is how this will work. I am here because I need a bed and a wage. You are here because nobody else wants to deal with you. If you leave me alone to read by the fire, I won't make you memorize French verbs. We can ignore each other, and everyone wins." It was a terrible pedagogical strategy. It was also the only honest thing she had said in a month. Josephine narrowed her eyes. "You aren't going to tell our uncle?" "Your uncle is in London," Beatrice said, picking at a loose thread on her cuff. "No, he isn't," Clara said casually, finally dropping the candlestick onto the table with a heavy thud. "He came back last night. He's in the library. He broke a glass." Beatrice's hand stilled on her cuff. A cold prickle of awareness washed over the back of her neck. She stood up. "Stay here." "Or what?" Josephine challenged. "Or don't," Beatrice said, already walking to the door. "But the fire in here is the only warm spot in this wing." She closed the door behind her, leaning against the wood for a moment, closing her eyes. The Duke was here, the man who supposedly cut out a man's eye over a game of whist. She needed to know the layout of the house. She needed to know where he was, so she could stay exactly on the opposite side of the estate. By 3 o'clock, the nursery fire had dwindled to pathetic orange embers. The coal bucket was empty. Mrs. Gable's rule echoed in Beatrice's head, but the girls' hands were turning a faint, mottled blue. They had spent the last hour silently cutting paper into tiny shreds, subdued by the creeping chill of the stone walls. Beatrice grabbed the empty tin bucket. The handle was cold iron, biting into her palm. "I'll be back," she muttered, not waiting for a response. She descended the main staircase, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the threadbare runner. The lower floors were a labyrinth of shadows. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the grey afternoon light. She navigated by the smell of wood smoke, hoping to find a parlour or a study with a stocked scuttle. She turned down a corridor in the east wing, the wing Mrs. Gable had expressly forbidden. Beatrice didn't care. Frostbite was a stronger deterrent than a housekeeper's warning. A door stood ajar at the end of the hall. Faint golden light spilled onto the floorboards. Beatrice approached, holding the bucket against her skirt to keep it from clanking. She peered around the edge of the heavy mahogany door. It was the library. It smelled of ancient, leather-bound decay, beeswax, and a very sharp, very expensive whiskey. Dust motes danced lazily in the light of a roaring, massive hearth fire. Beside the hearth sat an iron scuttle, overflowing with black, shiny coal. Beatrice didn't look at the rest of the room. She looked at the coal. She slipped inside. She moved quickly, dropping to her knees by the hearth. She didn't bother with the tongs, they were too loud. She grabbed a jagged lump of coal with her bare hand and dropped it gently into her bucket. It left a smear of black dust on her pale skin. She grabbed another. Thievery is a bold choice on your first day. The voice didn't boom. It was a low, scraping baritone, like a shovel dragging across stone. Beatrice froze. Her fingers were wrapped around a third lump of coal. She slowly turned her head. Sitting in a wingback chair, engulfed by the shadows of the far corner, was a man. He wasn't lounging. He sat rigidly, a heavy crystal glass held loosely in one hand. Arthur Pendleton didn't look like a romance novel duke. There was nothing soft or poetic about him. He had harsh, angular features, skin pale from a lack of sun, and dark hair that needed cutting. He wore a crisp white shirt without a cravat, the collar open, exposing a throat that looked tight with tension. He smelled of stale brandy, cold ash, and wet wool, but it was his eyes that made Beatrice's breath hitch. They were flat, colourless, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a man calculating the exact cost of breaking something. Beatrice didn't drop the coal. She stood up, her knees cracking in the quiet room, and dropped the lump into her bucket. "It isn't theft," she said, wiping her blackened fingers on her dark apron. "I work here. The coal is for the nursery. Your nieces are freezing." Arthur took a slow sip of his whiskey. The ice clinked. It was the only sound in the room. "Mrs. Gable allots the coal," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Mrs. Gable is not sitting in a room that is currently 40 degrees, Beatrice fired back. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to bow her head, to scrape and grovel. But looking at him, she knew instinctively that weakness wouldn't save her. Men like him fed on apologies. Arthur tilted his head. He set the glass down on a side table. The deliberate slowness of the movement made Beatrice's stomach clench. He stood. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered but lean, moving with an eerie, predatory grace. He walked out of the shadows and stopped 3 feet away from her. The smell of the whiskey was stronger now, laced with something metallic and harsh. He looked down at her. Beatrice locked her knees so she wouldn't sway. She forced herself to meet his eyes, noting the faint, dark circles beneath them. He looked exhausted, dangerously exhausted. "You are the new governess," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Beatrice Hallam. You are standing in my library, Miss Hallam, with mud on your boots, ruining a very old Persian rug, stealing my coal, and taking a tone that implies you think I care about the temperature of the nursery." "I don't think you care about anything, Your Grace," Beatrice said. The words slipped out before her brain could catch them. A fatal flaw. Her mouth always moved faster than her survival instincts. For a long, agonizing second, Arthur Pendleton just stared at her. The silence stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. Beatrice braced herself to be fired, to be thrown out into the mud, to be ruined. Instead, a tiny, almost imperceptible muscle feathered in his jaw. He reached out. Beatrice didn't flinch, though every nerve in her body screamed. He didn't touch her. He bypassed her entirely, grabbed the heavy iron coal scuttle by the hearth, and dumped the entire contents into her tin bucket. A massive cloud of black dust plumed into the air. He dropped the empty scuttle back onto the stones with a deafening clang. "Take your coal, Miss Hallam," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, returning to that flat, dead tone. "And if you ever enter my study uninvited again, I will have you removed from the property by the scruff of your neck." He turned his back on her, walking back to his chair in the shadows. Beatrice picked up her bucket. It was agonizingly heavy now. The iron handle bit into her palms. She didn't say thank you. She knew a dismissal when she heard one. She walked to the door, dragging the bucket slightly because her shoulder simply couldn't take the weight. She paused in the doorway. "They don't have enough blankets either," Beatrice said to the shadows. She didn't wait for an answer. She pulled the door shut, leaving the dangerous Duke of Rothay alone in the dark. As she hauled the coal up the freezing staircase, her hands were shaking. Not from fear, she realized, with a strange, twisting sensation in her gut, from the sheer, terrifying thrill of pushing back. Morning arrived, not with sunlight, but with a creeping damp grey that seeped through the cracks in the window frame. Beatrice woke with a sharp intake of breath. Her right shoulder, abused by the weight of the iron coal bucket, throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. She threw off her thin quilt. The air in her narrow room was viscous and freezing. A thin crust of ice had formed over the water in her porcelain wash basin. She broke it with the heel of her hand, the sharp sound cracking like a pistol shot in the silence. She washed her face with the freezing water, the shock of it forcing her lungs to work, wiping away the lingering exhaustion with a rag that smelled faintly of mildew. By the time she reached the nursery, the fire she had banked the night before was nothing but warm ash. Clara and Josephine were huddled under a rug on the floor, their knees tucked beneath their chins, glaring at the empty grate. Beatrice didn't offer a cheerful good morning. She knelt on the hearth, ignoring the ache in her shoulder, and began to build a new fire from the stolen coal. The acrid smell of sulphur and smoke quickly filled the room, followed by the slow, glorious radiation of heat. "My feet are numb," Josephine announced, her voice raspy. "Sit closer to the grate," Beatrice replied, dusting her hands on her skirt. "And rub them. Friction generates heat, a basic principle of survival." Clara watched her with dark, calculating eyes. "Did Uncle Arthur yell at you?" "Yes." "Why didn't you leave? The last one left when he yelled." "Because your uncle's temper is less frightening than starving in the streets of London," Beatrice said bluntly. She stood up. "I am going to fetch your breakfast. If you set the rug on fire while I am gone, I will leave you in the ashes." The corridors of Oak Haven were different this morning. The oppressive, empty silence had been replaced by a frantic, suppressed energy. Maids moved with their heads bowed, scrubbing floors with frantic speed. The Duke's presence was a physical weight pressing down on the estate. Beatrice descended to the kitchen. It was a cavernous room, suffocatingly hot, smelling of yeast, boiling oats, and burnt pork fat. The kitchen staff was in a state of muted panic. Mrs. Gable stood by the massive iron stove, her face pale, barking orders in a harsh whisper. In the centre of the chaos, sitting casually on a rough-hewn preparation table, was Arthur Pendleton. He looked worse than he had the previous afternoon. He wore riding boots caked in fresh mud, breeches, and a dark linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His dark hair was damp with rain. He was nursing a tin cup in his hands, staring blankly at the far wall. The knuckles on his right hand were split and crusted with dried blood. The kitchen maids were giving him a wide berth, terrified to even glance in his direction. Beatrice stopped in the doorway. She needed 2 bowls of porridge. She did not want to walk past the man who looked like he had just beaten someone to a pulp in an alleyway. But her stomach was cramping with hunger, and the twins were waiting. She stepped into the room. Her boots scraped against the flagstones. Arthur's head snapped toward her. His eyes, the colour of dirty ice, locked onto her face. Beatrice kept her chin level. She walked directly to the stove, grabbing a wooden tray from a stack. She picked up the heavy iron ladle and began scooping thick, grey porridge into 2 wooden bowls. The silence in the kitchen was suddenly absolute. The only sound was the wet slap of the oats hitting the wood. "You are feeding them slop." The voice was directly behind her, low, gravelly, and entirely too close. Beatrice didn't flinch, though the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She finished filling the second bowl before turning around. Arthur was standing less than 2 feet away. Up close, the smell of him was overwhelming. Wet leather, rain, a metallic tang of blood, and the sharp, bitter aroma of roasted coffee beans emanating from his tin cup. "I am feeding them what is available in the pots, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice a calm, flat line. "If you wish for them to eat roasted pheasant, I suggest you instruct your cook." Mrs. Gable let out a strangled, horrified gasp from the corner. Arthur stared down at her. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely hollowed out, observing her like a strange insect he had found crawling across his ledger. His gaze flicked down to her hands, noting the lingering black coal dust embedded in her cuticles. "They need blankets," Beatrice said, seizing the moment. She wasn't going to get another chance. "The nursery has 2 thin quilts. It is November. I need 4 thick wool blankets." Arthur took a sip from his tin cup. He didn't break eye contact. "Mrs. Gable manages the linens." "Mrs. Gable manages the linens according to a ledger." Beatrice shot back, her pulse thrumming in her throat. "I am telling you, as the person watching them shiver, that they need blankets, unless you prefer to pay for a doctor when they catch pneumonia. I assure you, wool is cheaper than medical bills." It was a terrible gamble. Bringing up money to a man known for ruthless financial extortion. Arthur's jaw tightened. The split skin on his knuckles stretched as he gripped the cup. He looked past her, toward the terrified housekeeper huddled by the pantry. "Mrs. Gable," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the massive room like a whip crack. "Yes, Your Grace." "Give Miss Hallam the blankets from the blue guest suite, the heavy ones." "But Your Grace, those are for—" Now, it wasn't a shout. It was a flat, dead drop of a word that left no room for oxygen. Mrs. Gable scrambled away, her heavy skirts swishing frantically against the stone floor. Arthur looked back at Beatrice. "Take your slop, Miss Hallam, and try not to antagonize my staff before 8 in the morning." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his boots leaving a trail of wet mud on the pristine flagstones. Beatrice stood there, her hands gripping the edges of the wooden tray so tightly her fingers ached. She had won. It felt remarkably like surviving a shipwreck. 5 days passed. The heavy wool blankets from the blue suite smelled faintly of lavender and dust, but they held the heat. The nursery became a small, localized sanctuary of warmth in the sprawling, freezing estate. Beatrice established a brutal, pragmatic routine. She didn't teach the twins embroidery or piano. She taught them how to count using stolen coppers, how to mend a tear in their woolen stockings so the cold wouldn't bite their ankles, and how to read by taking turns with her battered copy of Milton, skipping the theological debates and focusing on the descriptions of hellfire. The twins liked the hellfire. They were still feral. They still spat, bit, and threw heavy objects, but they stopped throwing them at Beatrice. She had become a fixture in their environment, a piece of furniture that occasionally provided heat and food. It was not affection, but it was a truce. Then came Thursday. The rain had been falling for 48 hours straight, a relentless drumming assault against the glass that drove everyone inside Oakhaven slowly mad. The damp seeped into the walls, smelling of rot and wet earth. Beatrice was sitting by the hearth, darning a hole in her only good pair of stockings. When she realized the nursery was too quiet, she looked up. The corner where the girls had been building a fortress out of wooden blocks was empty. The heavy oak door was cracked open, letting in a cold draft from the hallway. A spike of pure, icy adrenaline hit her stomach. She dropped the stocking and hurried into the corridor. The shadows were deep in the late afternoon gloom. "Clara! Josephine!" She kept her voice low, not wanting to alert the rest of the house. She followed the draft. It led toward the main staircase, and then, horrifyingly, toward the east wing. Beatrice broke into a run, her soft soles silent on the carpets. She turned the corner into the forbidden hallway. She stopped dead. Halfway down the corridor, standing perfectly still, was Arthur. He was dressed immaculately today, in a dark wool coat and a crisp cravat, though he still looked as though he hadn't slept in a decade. Cornered against the flocked wallpaper, looking like 2 terrified, muddy badgers, were the twins. Arthur's hand was outstretched. "Give it back." His voice wasn't raised, but it carried a lethal, quiet pressure. Clara had her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her pinafore. Her small face was defiant, but her chin was trembling violently. Josephine was pressed flat against the wall, her eyes wide with genuine terror. "I don't have it," Clara lied, her voice cracking. Arthur took a slow step forward. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I do not tolerate liars, Clara, and I do not tolerate thieves. Open your hands." He was too big, too dark, and too terrifying. Clara shrank back, a small, pathetic sound escaping her throat. She wasn't a hardened criminal. She was a neglected 8-year-old playing a game she didn't understand. Beatrice didn't think. The pragmatic, cynical part of her brain screamed to stay out of it, to let the Duke discipline his own blood. But her legs were already moving. She walked quickly down the hall, stepping deliberately between Arthur and the girls. She put her back to the twins, facing the Duke of Rothay. Arthur's eyes snapped to her. They were darker today, an angry, turbulent slate. "Step aside, Miss Hallam." "What did she take?" Beatrice asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic hammering of her heart. "That is none of your concern. Step aside." He leaned in slightly, closing the distance. The smell of sandalwood and cold iron washed over her. He was trying to intimidate her, using his sheer physical presence to force her submission. Beatrice held her ground, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "It is my concern. They are my wards. If they have misbehaved, I will handle it." Arthur let out a harsh, scraped sound that might have been a laugh. "You cannot handle them. They are wild animals. She stole my pocket watch from the console table, a gold watch that belonged to my father." Beatrice didn't turn around. She reached a hand behind her back, her fingers snapping twice. A sharp, commanding sound. "Clara," Beatrice said, her voice dropping all warmth, replacing it with the steel she used to collect her father's bad debts. "Put it in my hand. Now." Silence stretched in the hallway. Arthur watched Beatrice, his eyes narrowing slightly, the furious tension in his shoulders shifting into something resembling curiosity. Behind her, Beatrice heard a small sniffle. Then, the cold, heavy weight of a gold pocket watch dropped into her waiting palm. Beatrice closed her fingers around it. She pulled her hand forward and held it out to Arthur. Arthur looked at the watch, then up at her face. He didn't take it immediately. "They don't steal because they want gold, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low murmur meant only for him. "They steal because taking something of yours is the only way to make you look at them." Arthur's jaw locked. The muscle there jumped frantically. For a second, Beatrice thought he might strike her. She had overstepped, crossed a massive, dangerous line. Instead, he snatched the watch from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. His skin was burning hot, a stark contrast to the freezing air of the corridor. "Keep them out of this wing," Arthur said, his voice scraped raw. "If I catch them here again, I will lock them in the attic." "Understood," Beatrice said flatly. Arthur turned on his heel and walked away, his heavy boots pounding a steady, angry rhythm against the floorboards until he disappeared into his study, the door slamming shut with a violent crack. Beatrice let out a long, shaky breath, her knees suddenly feeling like water. She turned around to face the twins. Clara was crying silently, wiping her dirty nose on her sleeve. Beatrice didn't hug them. She didn't offer sweet words of comfort. She crouched down until she was eye level with them. "If you ever steal from him again," Beatrice said, her voice quiet and hard, "I will not step between you. Do you understand?" Clara nodded frantically. "Good. Now go to the nursery. We are learning fractions, and you are going to count the coals in the bucket until you get it right." She watched them scurry back down the hall, their small frames casting long shadows. Beatrice leaned against the wallpaper for a moment, closing her eyes. She had just managed to anger the most dangerous man in England, not to protect her own neck, but for 2 feral children who had tried to drop a frog in her tea. She rubbed her chest, right over her heart. It was a dangerous, foolish complication. And in Oakhaven, complications usually ended up dead or destitute. Sweat smelled sharp, like old pennies and sour milk. It soaked the collar of Josephine's nightgown and plastered her dark hair against her skull. Beatrice plunged a ragged cloth into the wash basin. The water was glacial, but when she pressed the wrung-out fabric against the child's forehead, it was hot to the touch within seconds. Josephine thrashed, her small hands clawing blindly at the heavy wool blankets. A dry, rattling cough tore out of her throat, sounding like paper tearing in a quiet room. It was 2 in the morning. The nursery fire was a dull, resentful orange, doing nothing to combat the draft howling through the window frames. "Is she dying?" Clara whispered from the other side of the mattress. She was entirely buried under a quilt, only her wide, terrified eyes visible in the gloom. "No," Beatrice said. Her voice was flat, carrying a certainty she absolutely did not feel. She rinsed the rag again. Her knuckles ached from the freezing water. "She is boiling. There is a difference." But the fever was climbing. Beatrice had spent the last 2 hours administering cold compresses and forcing spoonfuls of tepid water past Josephine's cracked lips, but the heat radiating from the 8-year-old was becoming terrifying. Beatrice stood up. Her knees popped loudly in the silence. She wiped her wet hands on her apron. "Stay under the quilt, Clara." She didn't bother with a candle. She knew the way to Mrs. Gable's quarters on the first floor. She navigated the pitch-black staircase by memory and the subtle groan of the floorboards, descending into the belly of the house. She pounded on the housekeeper's door. 3 hard, sharp knocks. It took a full minute before the door cracked open, revealing Mrs. Gable in a flannel wrapper, clutching a sputtering tallow candle. "Have you lost your mind?" the housekeeper hissed, her face contorted in shadows. "Josephine has a fever," Beatrice said, not bothering to lower her voice. "A severe one. Her chest is rattling. I need the key to the medicine cabinet for Willowbark, and I need you to send a stable boy for the doctor in the village." Mrs. Gable's eyes widened, then narrowed into stubborn slits. "At this hour? The roads are entirely washed out, and His Grace strictly forbade any expenses this month without his direct signature. I cannot summon a physician for a child's sniffle." "It is not a sniffle. She is burning alive." "I will come up with a mustard plaster at dawn," Mrs. Gable said firmly. "You are dismissed, Miss Hallam." She moved to shut the door. Beatrice slammed her boot heavily into the gap. The wood bit painfully through the soft leather into her toes, but she didn't flinch. "If she dies before dawn," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper, "I will ensure the Duke knows exactly who decided a mustard plaster was sufficient for a rattling lung. Do you want to test his temper on a dead niece, Mrs. Gable?" The housekeeper paled, her grip on the candle trembling. But her rigid obedience to the household ledger won out. "I cannot authorize the expense, not without His Grace, and he is not to be disturbed. He has been locked in the study since yesterday." Beatrice yanked her foot back. The door clicked shut with finality. She stood in the freezing dark corridor for 5 seconds, calculating. A rational governess would go back upstairs and pray. A rational woman would not cross Arthur Pendleton twice in 1 week. Beatrice turned on her heel and walked toward the east wing. Light bled from beneath the heavy mahogany door of the study. Beatrice didn't knock. She turned the brass handle and shoved the door open. The air inside was suffocatingly hot, smelling of cigar smoke, hot wax, and old parchment. Arthur was seated at a massive desk, illuminated by 3 candelabras. He was stripped down to his shirt sleeves, his waistcoat discarded on the floor. Stacks of ledgers and loose correspondence formed jagged mountains around him. His head snapped up. His eyes were red-rimmed and wild, a stark contrast to his usual deadened calm. He looked dangerous. He looked like a man interrupted in the middle of bleeding out. "Get out!" The words were a quiet, terrifying rasp. Beatrice walked forward, stopping just at the edge of the Persian rug. "Josephine is sick. She needs a doctor, and your housekeeper refuses to send for one without your signature." Arthur rubbed a hand brutally over his face. He didn't look at her. "Give her a hot drink. It is a draughty house. Everyone is sick." "She is delirious," Beatrice pressed, stepping closer. The heat of the fire was baking the dampness out of her skirt, sending up a faint smell of wet wool. "Her chest is rattling. I cannot break the fever with rags, and I will not sit there and watch her suffocate because you are too busy balancing ledgers." Arthur froze. His hand dropped to the desk. He looked up at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she had barged in. He took in her dishevelled hair, the water soaking the front of her apron, the absolute, rigid defiance in her posture. "Do not mistake my tolerance for weakness, Miss Hallam," he said, his voice terrifyingly soft. "You push too far." "I am pushing because an 8-year-old girl is currently drowning in her own lungs on the 3rd floor," Beatrice snapped, the raw adrenaline finally shredding her composure. Her hands were shaking, and she hated it. She gripped her apron to hide the tremor. "I do not care about your ledgers. I do not care about your temper. Send someone to the village, or I will saddle a horse and go myself. And I do not know how to ride." Silence fell over the study. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with agonizing slowness. Arthur stared at her. The anger in his eyes slowly shifted, replaced by something dark and unreadable. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping violently against the floorboards. He didn't grab a coat. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing heavily against hers. The scent of stale tobacco and sheer, exhausted male heat washed over her. "Show me," he demanded, already heading for the door. Beatrice turned and followed him into the freezing dark. Dawn broke like a bruised plum against the frosted glass of the nursery window. The doctor had come and gone, smelling of gin and peppermint. He had applied a poultice, forced a spoonful of laudanum and honey down Josephine's throat, and taken Arthur's gold coins with trembling hands. Now, the room was stifling. The fire had been built up into a roaring blaze. Beatrice sat on the floor, leaning her back against the wooden frame of the bed. Her body ached with a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. Josephine's breathing had finally evened out. The rattling was gone, replaced by the soft, rhythmic sighs of a deeply sedated sleep. Clara was curled up at the foot of the bed, snoring softly. Beatrice let her head fall back against the wood, closing her eyes. "Drink this." She opened her eyes. Arthur was standing over her. He had been in the nursery for 4 hours. He hadn't paced. He hadn't barked orders. He had simply stood by the window, a silent, brooding sentinel in the shadows, watching the doctor work. He was holding out a silver flask. Beatrice stared at it. Then she reached up and took it. Her fingers brushed his, and this time, his skin was as cold as hers. She unscrewed the cap and took a swallow. The whiskey was liquid fire. It burned a path straight down her throat and hit her stomach like a punch, radiating a sudden, violent warmth. She gasped, coughing once, and handed the flask back. "Thank you," she rasped. Arthur didn't pocket the flask. He sank down onto the floor, sitting a few feet away from her, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth. It was a bizarre, intensely intimate thing to witness. The Duke of Rothay, a man who destroyed shipping companies before breakfast, sitting on a dusty nursery rug in his shirt sleeves. He took a drink from the flask, staring into the flames. "She will be fine," Arthur said. It wasn't a comfort. It was a statement of fact. "Dr. Evans is a drunk, but he knows lungs." "Mrs. Gable was not going to send for him," Beatrice said quietly, staring at her hands. The knuckles were chapped raw. "Mrs. Gable is terrified of me," Arthur replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "She knows the estate is hemorrhaging money. My brother, their father, was a man who enjoyed gambling more than he enjoyed breathing. He left Oakhaven drowning in debt. I spend my days tearing apart ledgers, trying to keep the roof over their heads, and in return, my staff believes I will murder them if they spend a shilling on a bandage." Beatrice looked at him. In the harsh grey light of the dawn, the lines around his eyes were carved deep. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man holding up a collapsing building with his bare hands. "You let them believe it," Beatrice pointed out. Arthur turned his head, his pale eyes locked onto hers. "Fear is efficient, Miss Hallam. It keeps people out of my way. If they think I am a monster, they do not ask me for favours I cannot afford to grant. It also leaves your nieces cutting up paper in a freezing room because they are too afraid to ask for coal," she said bluntly. A muscle flickered in his jaw. He didn't look angry. He looked stripped bare. "I do not know what to do with them. I'm not a father. I'm a liquidator. I know how to sell assets and ruin rivals. I do not know how to speak to an 8-year-old without making her cry." He looked back at the fire. "When their mother died, she sent them here. She hated me. But she knew I would not let them starve. That is the extent of my capability. I provide the walls. I cannot provide the warmth. Beatrice drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around her shins. The silence between them stretched, but the bitter, hostile edge was gone. It was replaced by a heavy, mutual understanding. "I am not a governess," Beatrice said. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. It was the whiskey, she told herself, the exhaustion. Arthur didn't gasp. He didn't even look surprised. He took another slow sip from the flask. "I assumed," he said calmly. "Your references were immaculate, too immaculate. The handwriting on the letter from Lord Cavendish matched the handwriting on your signature." Beatrice's heart gave a hard, painful thump. "You knew." "I am a businessman, Beatrice. Forgery is a common currency in my world." He rested his forearms on his knees, turning to fully face her. The use of her first name sent a strange, unauthorized jolt through her spine. "Your hands are calloused. You haggle over coal like a dock worker. You do not cower, you do not weep, and you stare me down as if I am a particularly annoying stray dog." He leaned slightly closer, the smell of the whiskey and the sandalwood wrapped around her. "Whoever you were before you walked through my doors, you were fighting for your life." Beatrice swallowed hard. The urge to lie, to construct a new alibi, rose in her throat and died instantly. "I was a bookkeeper's daughter. He died owing money to a man who did not want cash in return. I took the papers of a woman who died of consumption in our boarding house and ran." She braced herself for the dismissal, for the cold, practical reality that she was a liability he didn't need. Arthur stared at her for a long, heavy moment. His eyes dropped to her mouth, lingering there for a fraction of a second, before returning to her eyes. "Then we are both frauds," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I pretend to be a monster to keep the world at bay. You pretend to be a lady to survive it." He reached out. Beatrice stopped breathing. His hand, large and rough, moved toward her face. He didn't touch her skin. Instead, his fingers brushed against a stray damp curl of hair hanging by her cheek, gently pushing it back behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violence of his reputation. "You saved her life tonight," he said. "I was just doing my job." Arthur let out a low, humorless exhale. "Your job was to keep them quiet. You broke down my door and threatened my housekeeper." His hand dropped away, and Beatrice immediately missed the phantom heat of it. "You have a home here, Beatrice, for as long as you need it. No one will come looking for you at Oakhaven. I will make sure of it." He stood up, his joints popping, and brushed the dust from his trousers. He looked down at her one last time, the mask of the ruthless Duke sliding back into place, though the edges were slightly crooked. "Get some sleep, Miss Hallam. The girls will need you when they wake." He walked out of the nursery, closing the heavy oak door softly behind him. Beatrice sat on the floor, staring at the closed door. Her shoulder throbbed. Her chest ached. But as she listened to the steady, healthy breathing of the child on the bed, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she had stopped running. She was moored. And the anchor was a man who terrified everyone in England but her. December arrived not with snow, but with a bone-aching frost that turned the mud around Oakhaven into jagged iron-hard ridges. Inside, the dynamic of the house had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. Beatrice no longer ate in the freezing kitchen. She took her meals in the nursery with the girls, and surprisingly often, Arthur joined them. He rarely spoke during these breakfasts. He would sit in a painfully undersized wooden chair, drinking black coffee, watching Clara and Josephine argue over who got the burnt crusts of bread. He was a silent, massive weight in the room, but the girls had stopped flinching when he moved. Josephine had even started kicking his shin under the table when she wanted the salt. He never reprimanded her. He simply handed over the cellar, but the estate was still dying. Beatrice saw it in the dwindling woodpile, the thinning soup, and the dark, bruised exhaustion hanging under Arthur's eyes. On a Tuesday afternoon, while the girls were occupied trying to teach a stray barn cat to wear a bonnet, Beatrice walked into the study. She carried a cup of tea, the cheap black kind, smelling of dried leaves and copper. Arthur was bent over his desk, his hands buried in his dark hair. The ledgers were spread out before him like a battlefield of red ink. Beatrice set the tea down near his elbow. He didn't look up. "The shipping manifest from the Bristol docks," Arthur muttered, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "It doesn't balance. It hasn't balanced for 3 months." Beatrice didn't ask for permission. She walked around the massive mahogany desk and stood beside him. She leaned over, bracing one hand on the back of his chair. He smelled of cold ash and the sharp, clean scent of lye soap. She looked at the columns of numbers. Her eyes, trained by years of squinting at her father's desperate attempts to cook his own books, moved rapidly down the page. "He's skimming," Beatrice said. Arthur went perfectly still. He turned his head. His face was inches from hers. "What? Your clerk in Bristol? Look here." Beatrice pointed to a line of cramped handwriting, her bare knuckle brushing against the rough linen of his sleeve. "He is listing the cargo tariffs at 4%. The Crown raised it to 6% in October. He is charging your buyers 6, recording 4, and pocketing the difference. It is a very sloppy, very arrogant theft." Arthur stared at the ledger. The silence in the room grew heavy, pregnant with a sudden, lethal tension. He didn't explode. The muscle in his jaw merely flexed once. "You can see that from a glance?" he asked quietly. "I grew up doing this, Arthur." It was the first time she had used his Christian name. It tasted strange on her tongue, heavy and solid. "My father was a terrible bookkeeper, but he taught me how to find the lies in the margins." Arthur leaned back in his chair, looking up at her. The winter light from the window caught the grey in his eyes, making them look like polished flint. "Sit down." He didn't motion to the chair opposite the desk. He pushed a stack of bound letters aside and patted the edge of the mahogany desk right beside him. Beatrice hesitated, the pragmatic part of her brain screaming that this was a boundary she should not cross. She crossed it anyway. She hoisted herself onto the edge of the desk, her wool skirt brushing his thigh. For the next 2 hours, they didn't speak of the cold, or the girls, or the fact that they were sitting close enough to share a single breath. They spoke in the language of numbers. Beatrice cross-referenced the manifests, while Arthur drafted ruthless, surgically precise letters of termination. It was an incredibly intimate act of destruction. They were halfway through the second ledger, when the heavy oak door of the study swung open without a knock. Mrs. Gable stood in the doorway, her face devoid of colour. "Your Grace, a gentleman is here." "I am not receiving," Arthur said, not looking up from his pen. He did not ask to be received, Arthur. The voice that followed Mrs. Gable into the room was oily, slick with false camaraderie. A man pushed past the housekeeper. He wore a heavy coat of plum-coloured velvet that smelled overwhelmingly of cheap violet pomade and damp dog. He was portly, with a thin moustache and eyes that darted around the room like a calculating insect. Arthur's pen stopped. He didn't look up immediately. Beatrice felt the tension radiate from him, a sudden violent heat that made her pulse spike. "Calloway," Arthur said, finally raising his head. His voice was dead. "A pleasure as always, Rothay," Calloway said, pulling off his leather gloves finger by finger. He looked at Beatrice, sitting on the edge of the desk, and a sleazy, knowing smile spread across his face. "I see you've found a new diversion to occupy your time while your debts fester." Beatrice's spine went rigid. She didn't look away, fixing Calloway with the same flat stare she used on fishmongers who tried to sell her rotten cod. Arthur stood up. He moved so fluidly it was terrifying. "Mrs. Gable, leave us." The housekeeper vanished, pulling the door shut behind her. "I have the writ, Arthur," Calloway said, his smile faltering slightly under Arthur's lifeless stare. He pulled a folded piece of heavy parchment from his coat. "The note your brother signed. It is due today. £5,000. If you do not have it, the magistrate has authorised me to begin seizing assets. I brought a carriage. I think I'll start with the paintings in the gallery, and perhaps that rug." He pointed a boot at the Persian rug with a sneer. My brother's signature was forged on that note, Calloway, Arthur said, taking a slow step around the desk. We both know he was too drunk that night to hold a pen. Prove it in chancery, Calloway countered, puffing out his chest. Until then, the writ is legal. Pay the gold, or step aside while I take what is mine. Beatrice watched Arthur's hands. They had balled into fists. The knuckles were bone white. He was calculating the cost of snapping Calloway's neck, and from the terrifying emptiness in his eyes, he was deciding he could afford the price. Arthur took another step. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to fatal. Calloway took a half step back, his velvet coat suddenly looking very thin against the sheer predatory mass of the Duke. I will bury you in the foundation of this house, Arthur whispered. Calloway opened his mouth, a terrified squeak trapped in his throat. Let me see the writ. Beatrice's voice cut through the heavy air like a glass shattering. She slid off the desk, her boots hitting the floorboards with a dull thud. She didn't wait for Calloway to offer the parchment. She walked straight up to him and snatched it from his sweaty hand. What are you doing? Calloway sputtered, recovering his bluster. You cannot let your whore touch legal documents, Rothay. Arthur lunged. Beatrice threw her left hand out, catching Arthur flat against his chest. He hit her palm with the force of a battering ram, the impact sending a jarring ache up her shoulder. But she dug her heels into the floor and held her ground. Stop! She commanded, not looking at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the parchment in her right hand. Beneath her palm, Arthur's heart was beating with a frantic, violent rhythm. His chest heaved, his muscles locked tight as coiled steel. She scanned the cramped legal script, her eyes darting over the dates, the seals, and the signatures. A cold, feral satisfaction bloomed in her stomach. This note is drawn against the Oakhaven timber rights, Beatrice said, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. Calloway sneered. Yes, which are forfeit. No, they aren't. Beatrice tossed the parchment onto the floor at Calloway's feet. She wiped her hand on her apron in a deliberate gesture of disgust. The timber rights were transferred to Clara and Josephine Pendleton upon their mother's death. They are a separate trust, entailed to the female line. Arthur does not own them. He only manages them. You cannot seize assets against an entailed trust for a personal gambling debt of a deceased male heir. Calloway blanched. That is nonsense. The magistrate signed it. The magistrate signed a writ authorizing collection against Arthur's property, Beatrice corrected, stepping closer to Calloway, forcing him to step back again. If you try to seize the paintings, which belong to the estate, using a note drawn against an invalid trust, you are committing theft. I assure you, the Duke of Rothay's solicitors will drag you through the courts until you are begging for bread in the gutters of Fleet Street. Calloway looked from the piece of paper on the floor to Beatrice, then to Arthur. Arthur was staring at Beatrice. The murderous rage had vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, staggering awe. He looked as though he had just watched her conjure fire from thin air. Pick up your garbage, Calloway, Arthur said, his voice returning to its familiar grating baritone. And get out of my house. Calloway bent down, his face a mottled, ugly purple. He snatched the writ, shoved it into his coat, and bolted for the door, the heavy oak slamming shut behind him. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. Beatrice let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline crashed out of her system all at once, leaving her knees feeling like wet paper. She turned to look at Arthur. He hadn't moved. He was still standing exactly where she had stopped him, his eyes locked on her face. Was that true? He asked, his voice low. I have no idea, Beatrice confessed, rubbing her temples. I read a book on property law 3 years ago. I made half of it up to buy you time to actually check the trust. A sound tore out of Arthur's throat. It was a harsh, scraping sound. It took Beatrice a second to realize he was laughing. It wasn't a joyful noise, but a release of pressure so intense it seemed to physically shake him. He closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He didn't ask. He framed her face with his hands, large, rough, calloused hands that smelled of ink and adrenaline. He tilted her head up and kissed her. There was nothing gentle or poetic about it. It was desperate. It was the collision of two people who had spent their entire lives bracing for the next blow. His mouth was hard and demanding, tasting of stale coffee and sharp relief. Beatrice gasped into his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his coat. She didn't pull away. She pulled him closer, her fingers digging into the heavy wool, anchoring herself against the solid, burning heat of him. She kissed him back, with all the pent-up, cynical fury she had carried since she arrived at Oakhaven. When he finally pulled back, he didn't go far. He rested his forehead against hers. They were both breathing heavily, the sound mingling in the quiet room. "You are a menace, Beatrice Hallam," he whispered, his thumb stroking the sharp lines of her cheekbones. "You are going to have to check the trust deeds tonight," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Because if I was wrong, he will be back with the sheriff tomorrow." Arthur let out a breath that ruffled the stray hairs on her forehead. "Let him come. Let them all come." He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms securely around her back, burying his face in her messy, unpinned hair. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The estate was still broke. The roof still leaked. The mud outside was still freezing. But standing in the dim light of the library, held by a man the world thought was a monster, Beatrice realized something profound. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was home. If you felt the chill of Oakhaven and the heat of Beatrice and Arthur's slow-burn romance, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button if you love heroines who fight back with ledgers instead of tears, and share this video with fellow historical romance fans who crave a deeply human, gritty love story. What did you think of Beatrice bluffing the debt collector? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next immersive storytelling experience. Until next time, stay warm and keep reading between the lines.